Hey guys, Tara here for Rev3 Games, and if you, like everybody else, have been wanting more info on Borderlands the pre-sequel, then you're in luck because we have it. Today I'm going to be leading you guys through the skill tree for Athena the Gladiator. This is sort of the tank character in the pre-sequel, which is cool because you don't often see women playing those kinds of roles in video games. She's got a really great skill tree. Her main action skill is what's called Kinetic Aspis. And this is basically a shield that she pulls up in her left hand and it absorbs oncoming bullets from enemies. It's got a timer on it, and so when the timer runs out, or if you want to end the timer early, she throws the shield back at her enemies and it deals double the amount of damage that it absorbed. So let's start with the Phalanx tree. This is probably the most tanky of the three trees. Most of the skills are going to be centered around buffing the Kinetic Aspis, but it also has some of the best co-op skills of the three trees. It starts off with some really basic stuff. Ephidos and Invictus increases your speed and damage while using the Aspis. Then you have Vanguard, Hold the Line, things that help your regen, health regen, and the duration of your Aspis. And then you have Prismatic Aegis. This allows the Aspis to absorb any kind of elemental damage, and it throws it back at enemies. Now, typically in Borderlands, if an enemy deals elemental damage, then they will also be resistant to that kind of damage. So on its own, I don't know how useful this skill really is, but when you combine it with some of the other skills in this tree, like Wrath of the Goddess, which I will get to in a second, it gets really awesome and powerful. So next skill is Clear. This is really good for a co-op. So after you've used your Aspis, you throw it back out, and this skill automatically grants Second Wind to any friends who are in range. So if any of them are dying, this will instantly revive them, but it also gives you a damage bonus when you enter a fight for your life. So if you're the kind of person who is maybe not super great at first-person shooters, and maybe you die a lot in Borderlands, then this is definitely a skill that you're gonna want. Stalwart is another really useful skill for co-op. This increases your maximum health, and it also lets your Aspis absorb damage from enemies and any friends who are in range. And the more points you put into this, the higher the percentage of damage you'll absorb, so the more damage you can ultimately deal. United Front, this one increases your maximum shield capacity, but it also allows any damage you absorb to power your shield and the shields of your teammates, so another good skill for co-op. And then you have Return Fire. This one is really, really cool. When you have your Aspis up, it gives you a chance to reflect lasers and bullets back at the enemy while the Aspis is still up. Typically, you just absorb damage and you can't really inflict it until you throw it back out. But this lets you reflect bullets back, so you do damage at the enemies while your Aspis is up, and then when you throw it out, it continues to absorb that damage. So when you throw it out, you can basically inflict a massive amount of damage at once. So you do a little bit of damage and then you finish the enemies off by throwing out your Aspis. Prepare for Glory. This one taunts enemies so that they attack you, and then for every enemy that attacks you while you have your Aspis up, you get an increase to your gun damage, and that is effective for a pretty short period after you throw the Aspis out. Lastly, you have Wrath of the Goddess, which I mentioned earlier. This is easily the coolest skill in the Phalanx tree, which is probably why it's at the bottom. And it allows the damage that you deal from your Aspis to ricochet off on up to 4 enemies, and each subsequent enemy it ricochets off of will take slightly less damage than the one before it. So you can imagine combining this with something like the Prismatic Aegis skill. So if you were, say, in an area with a lot of different kinds of enemies with different elemental damage types, you could absorb every type of elemental damage and then throw it all back at the enemies. So when it ricochets off each other, each enemy gets hit with like every kind of elemental damage. Really awesome to see in action. The second tree is the Zeuss tree, I think that's how you pronounce it. This one is going to be mostly melee focused, and it also gives you the power to inflict bleeding damage from your melee attacks, and that will drain the enemy's health and make them more vulnerable to bullets. At the top, again, you have more basic skills, Gun Kata and Clarity of Purpose. These are pretty basic skills that boost your gun damage, melee damage, increase your maximum health, things like that. Below those, you have Mercurial. This is a kill skill that increases your speed and gives you some damage resistance after you kill an enemy. And then next to that, there is Omega Senshu. This increases your damage against enemies with 50% health or lower. Rend, this is the basic bleeding skill. It causes enemies to bleed when you melee them, which inflicts more damage over time, like I said, and that varies based on the health of the enemy, as well as how many points you have in the thing. So enemies with higher health will bleed more damage than a guy who's almost dead. Epicenter is a slam alteration skill, one of the coolest skills in this tree, I think. In the game, you have the ability to fly through the air on your jetpack, and at any point you can press the crouch button mid-air to butt slam down on your enemies, and it actually deals quite a bit of damage. With this skill, when you slam down, it creates a singularity around you that pulls enemies in, so multiple enemies can absorb the damage from your slam attack. Really awesome to see in action. Tear increases your gun damage on enemies who are bleeding, and then Bloodlust gives you health regen while an enemy is bleeding, and if there are multiple enemies bleeding, it'll stack. So say you have the Rend skill, the Tear skill, and the Bloodlust skill all activated, and then you, for example, melee 3 different enemies in a row. All of them are bleeding, so they're losing health, you're regenerating health, and then any damage you do with your gun is going to be increased by that Tear skill. So with those 3 skills alone, you can deal a serious amount of damage, and you can make it even more awesome with the next skill, which is You've Got Red on You. This makes enemies explode and deal damage to other surrounding enemies when they're either bleeding or killed by a melee attack, which is amazing. And then you have Fury of the Arena. This increases your fire rate and reload speed for each enemy that you have bleeding. And then Blood Rush. This is a melee override skill. So when you press the melee button, you'll actually dash towards the enemy, so you don't have to be super close to them to use this. And it'll do increased melee damage as well. It's got a 10-second cooldown, but if you cause an enemy to bleed or die while you use this, then your cooldown automatically goes down to 0 and you can use it again right away, which is awesome. Last but not least, the Psoronic Storm Tree. This one deals with a lot of elemental damage and something called Maelstrom, which is just a buff that stacks and makes the rest of your skills more powerful. This particular tree also has a lot of skills relating to verticality, so if you are a fan of the jetpacks and the butt slam move and you like to use those a lot, then you will probably like this tree most. Starts off with Storm Weaving, which boosts your fire rate and your chance of inflicting elemental damage every time you swap weapons, which is interesting. And then you have Maelstrom. So when you deal either fire or shock damage, you gain stacks of Maelstrom, and then for every stack you have, it increases your elemental damage output. Below that is Conduit, which requires an active electrocute status effect to work, but if you have that, then you basically continually gain a percentage of your shields for every stack of Maelstrom that you have. To the left of that is Gathering Tempest, probably the most basic skill in the tree. It just increases your magazine size and reload speed, pretty boring stuff as far as Borderlands is concerned. Then you have Unrelenting, which is a kill skill, so every time you kill an enemy, it lessens the amount of time it takes to swap weapons, and it also increases your fire rate depending on how many Maelstrom stacks you have. And to the left of that is Smite. If you shoot an enemy while you're in the air, then you'll deal shock and fire damage. That increases, again, depending on how many Maelstrom stacks you have, but you have to have a minimum of 10 in order for it to work. And this also has a brief cooldown period. So as neat as this skill is, I will say that it's a lot harder than you might think to shoot an enemy from the air. So this is probably a skill that's better for more advanced players. Zeuss Rage. This is where the skill tree starts to get really awesome. So after you use your Aspis shield and you throw it out at enemies, Zeuss Rage creates a storm of fire and lightning around the enemy you target that gets stronger the more damage your Aspis has absorbed. Next to that is Superconductor, which lets your Aspis shock enemies if they hit you, also gives a bonus to your Maelstrom stacks, and then on the other side of that is Elemental Barrage, which ties in with your Storm Weaving skill. So if you swap weapons, you'll not only have a higher fire rate and a higher chance of inflicting elemental damage, you'll also have a chance with this skill to not consume ammo, and that chance increases the more stacks you have of Maelstrom. Flash Freeze is another interesting skill. When you freeze an enemy, it also freezes your Maelstrom stacks, so you can't lose any of your stacks, but you also can't gain any. If you put 1 point in the skill tree, then it gives you 1 second of that, and it goes up to 5 seconds if you put 5 points in. Not sure how useful that is. I'm guessing if you're being just attacked by a barrage of enemies, then it's probably really good and you want to keep those Maelstrom stacks. But if it's just one enemy, I can't see that skill being super useful. To the left of that is Overload. If you kill an enemy who's either electrocuted or on fire, then there is a chance that those effects will chain to a nearby enemy as well. And if that happens, then you gain a bonus to your Maelstrom stacks. Hades Shackles. This is one of the coolest skills among all 3 trees. When you slam an enemy, it creates a shock tether to all of the nearby enemies. so all of them get electrocuted. However, if you lose your line of sight with the original target, which is a common thing that happens when you're using the jetpack, then the tether gets broken. But if you can sustain the tether, then any enemy who either dies while tethered or is still tethered by the end of the duration, which is 3 seconds, they release a fire nova, and any surrounding enemy who's affected by it gives a bonus to your Maelstrom stack. So that is the Saronic Storm tree. Visually, I think it has some of the most interesting looking skills, and it also seems to have the most payoff, but it's definitely one of the more advanced, if not the most advanced, of the 3 skill trees. Personally, I have been playing with the Phalanx tree, which is a lot of fun. All of these trees are fun. I'm honestly constantly surprised by how fun and interesting and unique Borderlands continues to make all of their skill trees, even after the 3rd game. So that is Athena the Gladiator. Next week, I am going to be going over Wilhelm the Enforcer, and we'll also have hopefully a little bit more gameplay to go with that one than we did with this one. And then the week after that, we will have Nisha the Lawbringer. So Borderlands news all month of July. Look forward to it. And then of course the game is coming out on October 14th in North America, and everywhere else internationally October 17th. I could not be more excited. I hope you guys are too. Thanks for watching. And today I have Joel Eschler from 2K Australia and James Lopez from Gearbox with me. You guys are both producers on Borderlands, the pre-sequel, which is really exciting. I've been a huge Borderlands fan since day one. I'm curious why you guys decided to sort of stray away from the numbered sequels and go back in time with this one.